Okay, welcome everyone. I am Chris Brummer, a professor of law at Georgetown Law and also the faculty director of the Institute of International Economic Law. And I'm one of the co-hosts for today's conference. On behalf of the IIEL, the Graduate Institute, Geneva Center for Trade and Economic Integration, and the Geneva Trade Platform, it is my distinct pleasure to kick off our annual G2 conference. Now, for many years, the G2 conference has really been a forum and one of the best experiences really of the year, one that invites the trade community to join leading scholars and practitioners from all over the world to discuss the hottest topics in international law and trade policy. Now, this year's conference takes a little bit of a different spin. Not only is this our first virtual conference, but it's also the first time that we have challenged our students from both over at Georgetown, the Graduate Institute, and really from across the globe to a hackathon to propose solutions to substantive issues that the WTO should address or address differently. And I want to thank our sponsors, Aiken Gump, Lee & Co., and Mr. Papa for their generous support of today's conference. Now, at a moment when trade is being challenged by COVID-19, the resurgence of protectionist sentiment, and the WTO of obviously challenging or facing down crises across many of its core functions, we wanted to elevate new and fresh perspectives and bold ideas for the WTO's path forward. And we were blown away by the response we received to our hackathon challenge. 31 student teams registered, representing over 20 nationalities and 20 universities. After a 3-day hackathon sprint, we received over 20 legal proposals and bold solutions to issues that are of concern to our students and the world. Now, the quality, creativity, and variety of proposals was outstanding, and we wanted to thank our incredible jury for helping us select today's 3 finalists through several stages of review, all focused on the conference theme of how to make the WTO fit for future trade. And we have a fantastic program lined up today. First, George Mina, the ambassador and permanent representative of Australia to the WTO, will provide a keynote speech on the future of the WTO, followed by a panel on legal paths forward on WTO plurilaterals. Our hackathon plenary, and last but not least, our third panel outlining the path ahead for dispute settlement. The day concludes in a career networking event on our networking gathering, GatherTown. A conference like this takes a village to put together. So at this point, I would like to thank our teams at the Graduate Institute, the Geneva Trade Platform, and my own team here at the Institute of International Economic Law, including David Kleiman and also the wonderful Gabrielle Marceau for their invaluable help organizing the hackathon and conference. Before I hand over our first speaker, just a few housekeeping rules for the conference. We invite you to ask our questions using the Q&A platform. My colleague, Marie Kasperk, who has also been instrumental in getting this conference together, will be moderating the first Q&A with the ambassador and will guide you through the day as master of the ceremonies. And the Zoom link ends after each panel. Please reconnect using the same link after a 15-minute break. Now, we've created a virtual conference space again on GatherTown. And here you can bump into other members of the audience and have a quick video chat, hang out with others at our coffee area, see the videos submitted by all the teams, and you can find a link to that chat. With that, I would like to hand over our first speaker, Ambassador, to hand us, the viewers, over to our first speaker, Ambassador George Mina of the Permanent Mission of Australia to the WTO. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I know Marie's standing there to help us out as well, but I really want to thank you, Professor Brummer, and the organisers for assembling an extraordinary panel of speakers today. And what a distinguished group of scholars and thinkers this is. It's a real honour to address this group. As I said to Dimitri from the Geneva Trade Platform a few weeks ago when he asked me to do this address, I hadn't really understood imposter syndrome until this moment. So I look forward to the discussion. I want to start with the question of why an event like this matters. And I want to recall something that happened just 2 weeks ago. Now, normally the G20 and the G7 communiques aren't the most scintillating reading. But while reading the chair's statement from the G7 trade ministers meeting a couple of weeks ago, one phrase jumped out at me, and it was this, and I'll quote, "This year represents a clear inflection point for the world and the global economic architecture." And that phrase really stopped me. I thought, it's spot on. It is indeed an inflection point this year. First, an inflection point between rules and the exercise of power in international economic affairs. The balance has certainly shifted for the first time in a few decades, away from rules and towards power. We know the major powers are engaged in a strategic economic competition and in economic cooperation all at once. And they've undoubtedly been employing and deploying power in the face of each other. You're all familiar with the headlines that emerged 18, 24 months ago about soybeans, and to others outside of their bilateral relationship in the larger rise in tensions in international economic affairs, including, of course, on trade and investment. But it's not clear how far back the pendulum will swing. Are we headed back to rules? Will there be an equilibrium found? Or will there be more swings in the balance? Second, may I say, I think we appear to be at an inflection point between openness and insularity. There, of course, have been decided shifts in the international mood away from openness in recent years and towards what The Economist magazine called a couple of years ago the drawbridge approach to economic affairs. Pull up the drawbridge, raise protection, and that we are seeing felt in the politics in the industrialized West, and we are seeing, of course, in the deindustrializing parts of the United States or Western Europe, some of the political manifestations of that movement against openness. And the global pandemic has added substantially to that test. In fact, there might never have been a bigger stress test in the 7 or 8 decades of the multilateral trade regime than this pandemic. And it's not an overstatement to say for some governments, policymakers, this question about the struggle for resources on trade and health products is a life and death equation, and it's an equation that really is testing the normal instincts for cooperation, openness, and pushing some towards insularity and exacerbating that trend towards nativism. So we've got another spectrum to consider, another inflection point. We've got an inflection point on rules versus power, and we've got an inflection point on openness versus insularity. And we need to reflect on what the system's going to look like in another 25 years, a century on at that point from the birth of the global trading system. Are we going to be characterized more by rules or by power? Are we going to be characterized more by openness or insularity, or will we be settling somewhere at a middling point, an equilibrium point along these two spectrums? Now, one doesn't always recognize an inflection point in history when one is living through it. Normally, it becomes clear after the fact. But I think this time we're all feeling it. We're all seeing the way the system is evolving, and we are all, in particular during this pandemic, seeing the very real manifestations as we discuss issues like vaccine access and distribution on a daily basis, the impact of these major historical trends. So we're at these critical inflection points in the history of international economic lawmaking. And I want to now reflect on why an event like this matters. First, I'd say the obvious point that most of you distinguished scholars and policymakers will be very familiar with, and that is that public international law, of course, relies upon state practice, and that, of course, depends in turn on the big trends running through global politics. And there's no great insight, as I say, to those of you assembled here. It does bear reflecting upon, however, that the history of economic lawmaking internationally is underpinned by a policy community and an intellectual community that sustains that body of law. And leadership is very much needed. It's always been needed, there's no doubt. But there's perhaps a higher premium on that leadership of the two communities, the policy community and the intellectual community, at a time like now. We don't have the traditional stability in the system that had been underwritten by decades of Pax Americana and the various different consensus intellectual currents that underlied the global trade regime. So leadership's in particular demand at the moment from the policy and the academic communities. Stronger leadership is required by policymakers like those in my own government, assertive middle powers, as someone described us recently, who are committed to the system and who are willing to stand up for it. And that's why when ministers like my own travel internationally, they tend to talk about the importance of the authority of global rules. They tend to talk about the importance of getting rulemaking going again. But leadership's also required on the part of the scholar and intellectual community as well. We all know that international economic law is an act of construction, an act of engaging, studying, debating, and advancing the disciplines you are all engaged in. And that's why I particularly like the innovation of the hackathon that Professor Brummer mentioned earlier today. We need the young minds here, the students, to come up with new ways of thinking and to shake up some of the tired old shibboleths. And to the students here today at this conference, can I say, you are the ones. You're not just today's scholars, but you're tomorrow's professors and policymakers, and you will be sustaining the regime we shape today. So an event like this that brings together the policy making community and the academic community, that builds a culture of leadership to sustain and foster international economic lawmaking, is a positive project, and it could not have come at a more important time. Particularly as we were saying earlier, as we struggle with these currents that are competing for influence over the shape of the system. So I wish you all the best with your deliberations, and I look forward to the discussion today. Thanks very much, Marie and Professor Brummer.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Mina, for kicking us off with this inspiring keynote, defining this moment, particular moment, inflection point, as you coin it, of international economic law. My name is Marie Kasprek. As Professor Brummer has mentioned, I'm the Executive Director at the Georgetown Law Institute of International Economic Law, and I will be moderating the Q&A with Ambassador Mina and will be guiding you through today. So I encourage everybody to make use of the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of the screen in the middle to ask questions for the ambassador. In the meanwhile, I will kick off with the first question. I couldn't agree more on what you mentioned about this time of inflection, and I particularly liked how you phrased it with regarding an inflection point of rules versus power, and one on openness versus insularity. And so my question would be, in your speech, you referred to an inflection point away from rules and toward power. for countries with a great deal of power, the downside of this is obvious. But is there any argument for rules that superpowers might be receptive to? How do we get back to rules and convince people, larger powers that rules are the way to go?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it depends very much on some of our learnings over recent decades and earlier. The international economic system, of course, is built on a couple of key principles. One of which, of course, is openness, is the most favoured nation principle, and with that comes the stability and the economic prosperity. You have to go back only to a couple of centuries ago to Ricardo to see that central insight about the value of specialisation in international trade. So all countries, yes, it is within the gift of some to use might, but all countries benefit with stability, and all countries benefit with the gains that come from global trade and investment being able to move freely. And I think the pandemic, Marie, has just underlined that the value of that insight. It doesn't make sense for sovereign manufacturing capability to be spread across the 164 members of the WTO. It does make sense to share the benefits of that production. Just to take one example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And we actually, you already alluded to this special role that the pandemic plays in this moment, and how this exacerbates a lot of the trends that we've been seeing in the past years. But obviously, also, seeing a silver lining might be an impetus to actually come together to move forward. So in this slide, we received a question from the audience that alludes to the pandemic. Does this time of inflection mean that one of the lessons learned from COVID-19 will be including a broader spectrum of variables within these strictures and the attendant paradigms? For example, will we abandon the old false dichotomy between health and economics in favor of multivariable analysis of health with economic components and economics with health-oriented variables?
I probably want to draw the question around a little bit more, if I could, face to face. But look, if I can just react at a general level to that question, whether it's health security, whether it's national security, whether it is the growing concern for the worker in the formulation of trade policy, or whether it's larger public policy objectives, such as our common goal on environmental protection and climate risk mitigation. I think we all are engaged in a conversation about how better to ensure these public policy priorities are integrated into the trade regime. And the old sort of approach that nothing to see here, let's move on. I think that's definitely not the case today. I think the questioner, however, was going to an analytical point, and I probably want a little bit more elaboration on some of that multi-variable analysis that the question wanted us to draw out a little bit more before I jump in too much more, Marie.
No, thank you so much. We actually have another question that goes into this question of leadership that you touched upon, and this inflection point of leadership. Who is taking the leadership? And after that question, I'm also going to invite Gabrielle Marceau to join me on stage really briefly to ask a question to the ambassador herself. So the question before handing over to Gabrielle is, are preferential agreements overcoming the WTO as a rule maker on trade? And this question was sent to us by Vera, the WTO chair in Brazil. Thank you, Vera.
Yeah, that's a pretty common one, that question, and I think it's a really important question. The answer is yes and no. Yes, there's a massive amount of rulemaking energy and activity at the regional and bilateral levels. Over 400 bilateral FTAs, these mega FTAs that are now developing, whether it be the TTIP agreement, the TPP, the CPTPP in Asia, or the RCEP agreement in Asia as well, or some of the sectoral agreements that are now developing, the digital economy agreements that are developing and proliferating in Asia, deep agreements, deep integration agreements. So the energy is there, and it has been for 2 decades, and it is powerful. Is it overtaking rulemaking at the WTO or the WTO? Well, it's certainly overtaking the pace of rulemaking at the WTO, and that's a problem. Mm-hmm. It is not overtaking the WTO. In fact, every single one of these agreements is built upon WTO rules. Mm-hmm. They're built on the foundation of the WTO. They sit atop the WTO, and any weakening of the WTO is a weakening of that foundation. So I draw that distinction. The other thing I'd say, Marie, is it's really important for people to recognise some of the effort that is going on here at the WTO to bring that energy back. What we're doing with some of the plurilateral agreements you're going to talk about in the next session is we're drawing some of that energy that's been so evident in the regional and bilateral FTAs and multilateralising it here. The e-commerce negotiation is a wonderful example. We've all struck, some of the participants of the e-commerce initiative have struck high-level deals bilaterally, regionally, and we're bringing that same energy back here and trying to broaden it at the global level. So there are many elements to this, and it's not a simple binary equation. The interaction between the regional and bilateral system and the multilateral is getting more intense, not less. And I think we need to encourage that mutual reinforcement.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much. And I also look forward to Gabriella and her team taking that question on later in her panel. Gabrielle, your question.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Marie, and thank you, Ambassador Mina. My question is back to COVID and trade. And you know how trade traditional principles, sort of on the basis of efficiency, would argue for vaccine or medicines, that it's more efficient if a handful of producers produce the medicine and a handful invented them. However, we see now with India and others that government, and it makes sense, protect their own people and impose export restrictions because they want to protect and give the vaccine to their own people. And even the rules, 11 of the GATT allows for those export restrictions. Do you think that this drama of the COVID will shake up even basic principles such as MFN until we handle the crisis, the COVID crisis? Do you think that even those basic, simple economic principles will be set aside for a long time because of the COVID tragedy? Thank you.
Well, quite clearly, those tendencies have been there already in policymakers' minds, Gabrielle, and they've been exacerbated. There is absolutely no doubt they've been exacerbated by the pandemic. So my answer to you is the jury's still out. You know, when we had at the initial stages of the pandemic, the struggle for resources over masks and gloves and alcohol and sanitizer, you know, that was the initial phase, and then things started to calm, and there were a series of restrictions. You'd only need to see in my region where, ironically, you know, some of the countries most impacted by the crisis were the ones that are producing the PPE, for instance, in China. and there was a struggle to go to acquire those resources. Now we've moved into the same sorts of dilemmas when it comes to the distribution and the trade in vaccine product. Noting that this is a globalized exercise. For the sort of reasons you say, innovation occurs some places, but also we all heard from the producers, and there's a meeting going on right now at the WTO on this very point, that the producers depend on global integration, global supply chains, and in many cases, hundreds of component ingredients in their product. So the economic logic for open approaches is still there, even in this moment of crisis. In fact, it's never been more important. Never been more important that we share and distribute, for the simple reason that none of us are safe until all of us are protected and vaccinated. And never been more important for the sophisticated industry that's emerged out of this, the innovation that's emerged out of this on the IP and pharmaceutical side. And yet the tendencies are going to be there from policymakers to hold back, to hoard it, and so forth. Jury's still out. Tough question. And it will impact the way we live through this crisis in policy terms, will impact on larger patterns and larger trends in a longer term way.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Mina, and also Gabrielle, for an excellent question. We are almost out of time, so I will bundle two last questions for you, Ambassador. One is on the potential of the silver linings of the pandemic. I would say really asking if you think that COVID-19 might have the effect that plurilaterals actually have a greater chance of coming to fruition. Do you see a meeting of the moment for plurilaterals, and do you think that COVID-19, the pandemic, the urgency has an effect on that? And then the second one is maybe a more broad one to close your thoughts on the topic, and really more about that openness and the distribution of wealth among member states at the WTO. The question was framed as, we can only give legitimization to globalization and openness if we can show that people are not left out. So can trade ensure distribution of benefits, or do we need at the same time other economic measures to address this? So I think the question for you to close out there for me would be, what do you think the WTO can do or is doing to make trade more inclusive? Thank you.
Look, marvelous two questions, and probably need an hour, Marie, to tackle them properly. But if I want to perhaps tackle a slice of those two questions, I might do so by reference to electronic commerce. And what I'm about to say won't surprise people that know me or know Australia, because we are a country that has been through the hard times of the impact of insularity. 7 of our 12 decades as a federation were characterised by very insular policies. And we had a personality change a few decades ago. We're now very much reform players because of our own domestic experience. And the first of your questions about how COVID's impacted on the need for these plurilaterals. So I think the e-commerce initiative is a wonderful example of how, in policy imperative and in practical negotiating terms, the pandemic has really accelerated things. The pandemic has accelerated the trends towards the digital transformation in ways that we could never have imagined. And, you know, I certainly am doing a hell of a lot more online shopping than I ever had in 2019, in respect of the way we negotiate. Nicholas and his academic colleague Anthea Roberts have written about this. This world we're living in, this virtual world we're living in, actually has some advantages for how some negotiations can occur. So the e-commerce negotiations have actually been remarkably successful during this period of doing it all by screen. And to come to your second question, I think that the answer there is the one you'd expect me to note. And that is that in respect of an initiative and a technology like e-commerce, inclusion is fostered by this amazing new technology. What e-commerce has done is lower the costs of participating in the global market. Whether you're an exporter in the South Pacific, whether you're a micro or small business, whether you can only trade part-time because you've got a family to care about, you have other demands on your business and your own personal time, e-commerce has just lowered the barriers to entry in the global market in ways that mean international trade is no longer the preserve of the large multinationals. So absolutely, it has fostered inclusion, and that's one of the reasons we want to drive rulemaking and harmonisation in this particular subject matter. So you'll always find me, Marie, coming down on the side of openness, and to finish where we started, you'll always find me coming down on the side of rules. Thanks for the opportunity. Good luck with the rest of the conference. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so very much, Ambassador Mina, for taking the time to join us today and for your inspiring thoughts and kicking us off on, a positive note on openness and leadership and providing some silver lining on the future of the system. So thank you so much for joining us. I know that our next panel is already ready to start. So with that, I would like to introduce the chair of our next panel, Ms. Gabrielle Marceau, who will lead the conversation on WTO plurilaterals for the next hour. Gabrielle is professor of WTO law at the University of Geneva, as well as senior counselor at the WTO Research Division. Most importantly, however, she has been an invaluable part of this conference's organizing committee and the hackathon jury. So thank you so much for all your support and expertise, Gabrielle. Before handing over to Gabrielle, I would like to remind everyone that there will be time for Q&A and that you can ask questions to the panel through the Q&A function. With that, I'm handing over the baton to you and your panel, Gabrielle, to decipher if plurilaterals are unlocking the system or breaking it. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you again, Ambassador Mina, for staying with us. This panel is about plurilaterals, but I would say the new sorts of plurilaterals, the plurilaterals that belong to the future. And we have three excellent speakers who will be able to share with us their perspective. So Mirto Zambata, it was the head of the WTO unit of the EU in Brussels, will start, and she will be followed by James Nadempura from the Center of Trade and Investment in Delhi. And the third one, Professor Nicola Lamb from University of Queen, will sort of finish as third speaker. Each of them have insiders information, and of course, they have a formal role and academic interest. So after their first intervention of about 5 minutes each, I will invite them to comment on each other and then right away go to the floor with your questions and comments. And I'll go back and involve Ambassador Mina afterwards. Ambassador Mina, who's one of the convener of the e-commerce plurilateral. So please, Mirto, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today with you. I will talk about the European Union's views on how plurilateral processes and agreements fit into the WTO architecture and the spirit of the WTO. And I wanted to first take a step back and look at the context in which we're having this discussion, which is a context of the multilateral system in crisis, of what Ambassador Mina has talked about at an inflection point where we are at a risk of going the way of no rules as opposed to more rules, which is also what the Union would want to see. But I think that Ambassador Mina has covered this very well. So we in the Commission, we have dedicated quite some analysis on how we got to this crisis point, right? So we published a paper in 2018, a concept paper, and more recently in our trade policy communication that came out a few weeks ago in February. I won't go into that analysis, but suffice it to say that we have identified the locus of the crisis in the failure of the negotiating functions. Right. Since 1995, we have seen a substantial body of trade liberalization and of trade rulemaking taking place, but it has not been taking place in the WTO. It's been taking place in bilateral trade agreements, in regional trade agreements, and whereas the multilateral agenda has stalled and hasn't produced any substantial outcome other than a couple of bright spots of the trade facilitation agreement and the export subsidies prohibitions. But more perniciously, we have seen recently a tendency even towards unilateralism, when members lose faith in the multilateral trading system, that it can be effective to address a concern and go the wrong way. So for us, it is very clear that a reform of the WTO needs to happen. It needs to happen soon. But also that if that reform is going to be meaningful, it needs to lead to the unblocking of the negotiating function. It needs to allow members to tackle new issues like digital trade, like competitive neutrality, like the pandemic response that we've talked about, and also redress the imbalances that have arisen in the commitments that were made almost 30 years ago, because of course the membership has not been static. And the commitments that members made 30 years ago do not necessarily now reflect their trading heft and power. So, of course, we would like to see these negotiations arrive at multilateral outcome. So that's clear. But if that is not feasible, and in my view at the moment, it does not seem to be so across the board, then allowing outcomes negotiated by groups of interested members to be incorporated into the WTO architecture is a desirable outcome that can only strengthen the organization. It can only reposition it at the center of the world trading system and where liberalization and trade disciplines are made and where they're situated. So I'd like to touch very briefly on three things. First, the compatibility of plurilaterals with the WTO, both in spirit and in law. Second, the current possibilities that exist to incorporate plurilateral outcomes into the WTO architecture. And third, the EU's view and proposal for a reform of the treatment of plurilaterals in the WTO. So on the first point, the WTO agreements themselves provide for the possibility of plurilateral agreements. So an assertion that plurilateral outcomes as such are contrary to the spirit of the WTO must fail. The idea was there from the start. In fact, the WTO agreements themselves were built on the basis of plurilateral codes, and I think Nicola is going to talk about that later. Yes, multilateral agreements are the gold standard. No one disputes that. But the WTO recognizes that sometimes outcomes will take a plurilateral form, like the ITA, like the Annex 4 agreements. And here I want to make a distinction between plurilateral processes, which is what the JSIs are, and plurilateral outcomes. There is nothing in the agreement that requires members to seek permission to begin discussing new rules or new liberalization among themselves. So the current processes of the JSIs from the Buenos Aires declarations onwards are entirely in keeping with the rules. You have a group of members who want to discuss certain disciplines, certain rules. It is only when the JSIs yield an outcome, and depending on what the outcome will be, that we will need to enter into the discussion of how that outcome can be incorporated into the WTO architecture. Which leads me to my second point: how can plurilateral outcomes be incorporated under the current rules as we stand now? Here again, we should make a distinction between outcomes that modify existing rules, outcomes that form an agreement altogether to be incorporated into the WTO, and then outcomes that are additional specific commitments that are liable to scheduling. Both the first and the second examples would lead to an amendment procedure under Annex 10, right, of the GATT. And in the case of a new Annex 4 agreement, that would require a decision by consensus. But the third example, the scheduling of commitments, is, however, a unilateral decision by the scheduling member, subject to the oversight of the rest of the membership in the certification procedure. Again, this is something foreseen by the current rules and a process that has been used a number of times in the past, in particular in services, which is actually where that I know most, with the telecoms reference paper, the understanding on on commitments in financial services, even the maritime transport model schedule. In our view, this is how an outcome in the domestic regulation GSI should be recorded, using the inbuilt GATS provision that governs governs additional commitments under Article 18. Now, other GSIs, which are at an earlier stage of negotiations, like e-commerce, like investment facilitation, we will have to see once there is a clearer view as to the nature of the disciplines being negotiated there. Which brings me to my third point. What we are calling for, and you may have seen that in the communication that we published, which I'm sure you have all read with great attention, what we are calling for is a discussion on how plurilaterals are incorporated into the WTO. So we are clear that inscribing additional commitments into a schedule, which by the way is not limited to market access and national treatment commitments, but could also include new rules, as was the case in financial services. So that is a perfectly legitimate and legal process. However, not all plurilateral processes, whether ongoing or future ones, will produce outcomes that easily fit into the scheduling approach. And we want to see a discussion in the WTO among the entire membership on how the rules can be changed or modified to allow a smoother path for the incorporation of plurilateral outcomes into the WTO. Now, we firmly believe that the WTO must remain a consensus-based organization, right? That's not in doubt. But let's consider what consensus means. It means that no member can be forced to undertake commitments or have its rights and obligations changed without its consent. So what we want to discuss and review is to facilitate the incorporation of plurilateral agreements into the WTO, provided that they do not create obligations for non-participating members, they do not detract from the rights of non-participating members, and they're open to whomever wants to participate. So I'll end here.
Yes.
By recalling how I began, that we need to kickstart the WTO negotiating function. We can't do it multilaterally at the moment, but there is a plurilateral momentum. So our choice is we either take this momentum and bring it outcomes into the organization, or we let all that occur outside it.
Thank you, Mirto. I think I'll come back, I'll get back to you. I would only say that if you attend Ambassador Mina's sort of e-commerce sessions, you would think they are very actively negotiating. Now, James Nzimpura, you know the WTO system inside out. What can you say about this impetus, energy in plurilaterals?
Thank you, Dr. Gabriel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. In fact, it is a very insightful view from the EU side. But at the very bottom of the issue, we know that the WTO membership basically represents a spectrum of issues and interests. And we know that there are a number of differences. Perhaps we have got more differences than shared interests at times. And in this context, we are not really talking about plurilaterals. Most of us discussing this matter understand the meaning of the term plurilaterals, referred to as Annex 4 agreements and defined in Article 2 of the Marrakesh Agreement. But here we are actually talking about a different category of a plurilateral. Maybe my feeling is that that particular terminology may not be really accurate even. So when we come to the real issues, India and South Africa has submitted a paper a couple of months ago, and this paper has highlighted some of the issues. One of the major issues is, obviously, we know that most of the joint statement initiatives started without a clear mandate. And now, when we really look at the website, we come to know that The negotiations have intensified. They have happened at a very quick pace. And some of the members said that it is even nearing conclusion by the 12th Ministerial Conference. But a very natural question to ask here is, basically to the proponents is, if you have basically come to the end of the negotiation, in what manner, in what way would you like to give effect to the outcome of the negotiation? So the one important issue is, what is actually the legal status? So we know that one of the suggestions is to basically inscribe the outcome of the joint initiative into some kind of commitments within the schedule of concessions. Maybe some people can argue that that is actually a pragmatic way of incorporating the commitments. But it is also absolutely plausible to argue that it is actually a backdoor method of inserting the concessions. And here, as I mentioned earlier, there is absolutely no question about the plurilateral agreements having some kind of a role and existence within the WTO. But in that context, the entirety of the WTO membership will have to basically give their consent, or in other words, they have to give their blessings to that kind of a plurilateral initiative. So now a lot of people actually criticize this kind of an approach, saying that it is almost akin to throwing a wrench into the efforts in saving the WTO system. But it is also possible to argue that these kind of initiatives or efforts may look like saving the WTO system, but in the long run, it can have more damages. One of the major concerns is that even allowing the joint statement initiative to take effect in the suggested format is to de facto allow a few selected WTO members to even the Marrakesh Agreement without following the procedure mentioned in Article 10 of the Marrakesh Agreement. And we also know that in paragraph 9 of Article 10, there is a clear reference saying that if any plurilateral agreement has to be added to the WTO, then the members will have to exclusively take a decision by consensus. So there is a prescribed method. There is actually a clear provision within the Marrakesh Agreement, the constitutional WTO, to actually provide the addition of a plurilateral agreement. The one major concern seems to be that even a small WTO member has actually the possibility to veto the addition of an agreement. And that right, even if somebody wants to criticize, or maybe the kind of damaging impact that particular right may have, is nonetheless a well-ingrained principle within the WTO legal system. So my submission is that in the garb of saving the system, we shouldn't do something that can in the long term prove to be a mistake. Let me also talk about why this particular approach has its own drawbacks and deficiencies. We know that in the context of the existing plurilateral agreements under the WTO, the 4 Annex 4 agreements, most of these agreements actually dealt with a relatively minor subject matter, like bovine meat or international dairy agreement, or even civil aircraft. Naturally, the membership of these agreements were limited to only a few members who had a particular interest in that matter. But look at the issues that we are negotiating at the moment. Not we, I think some of the proponents are negotiating at the moment. Electronic commerce. It is nobody's guess that this will be the most important issue in the future. Digital economy will be the most important item for negotiation of the future. Obviously, the technology is changing in that area. And even if we agree on a particular commitment at this moment, the technological advancements can completely negate or make some of these commitments meaningless over a period of time. Look at the other initiatives as well. The joint initiative on domestic regulations in services. The objective is to actually bring in some very good regulatory principles, robust principles in the delivery of services. But at the same time, services is a very important sector. And we shouldn't also forget the fact that there has been a mandate right from 1998, which is actually given through the Working Party on Domestic Regulation, to come up with disciplines in the field of domestic regulation. So the one major challenge here is that, inscribing this kind of outcomes of joint initiatives in the schedules of members may not be the right way to do it. Sometimes the schedules are actually substituting the agreement. Let me give you just an example to you. In the domestic regulation on services, there is actually a reference to a transitional position. Provisions for developing countries. We know that in the context of the WTO agreements, any kind of a transitional provision has been inserted in the main agreement itself. We will find that in the TRIMS agreement or maybe in the TRIPS agreement. But here, even such an important provision is actually confined to an unknown place in the schedule of concessions. That is not the right way to do it, actually.
James?
I'm just concluding in a minute.
Yes, because you'll come back in a few minutes. Go ahead.
So the only suggestion, I'm just ending it. My only suggestion, my only point here is that the initiatives which we are talking about cannot be compared to the ITA one or even to the basic telecommunication reference paper. They are very different in nature. So I just want to conclude here saying that, all of us are really keen on saving the WTO, but the approach is actually different. Thank you.
Thank you. So Nicholas, I think you have a presentation. Am I correct? Yes.
Can you all see it?
Yes, and I understand you'll talk about the history. Wonderful. Go ahead.
Right. I'm going to try to put the WTO plurilaterals into a historical perspective. And what I want to gain from looking at that history is a better understanding of why WTO members or also GATT contracting parties have pursued plurilateral agreements. What are the concerns about these agreements, and what is the situation what's different about today than the situation that we may have seen in the GATT? So when we think about plurilaterals, we often think back to the Tokyo Round Codes, but my submission would be that plurilateral approach has actually been the norm in multilateral trade lawmaking prior to the formation of the WTO. So in fact, even the GATT itself could be understood as a plurilateral approach. One could ask, why did the founding members of the trade regime not negotiate tariff concessions at the Havana conference with all the 50 plus members that were there? Well, there are three reasons, and they really shed light on why GATT contracting parties have pursued this plurilateral approach. The first one was simply practicality. It's easier to negotiate among a smaller group of members. It was much easier to negotiate among the 23 contracting parties to the GATT than among the 50 parties who were at the Havana conference. The second reason was that the insiders would also have greater influence on the outcome of the negotiations. And that was a live consideration in the late 1940s. So Canada, the UK, the US said, well, if we don't allow all these smaller nations who are protectionist minded into the tariff negotiations, we get to set the level of ambition. We get to say how much are we going to reduce our tariffs. And then, and this is the kind of the icing on the cake, we can then subsequently compel the outsiders to join the agreement on the insiders' terms. So once we've concluded the tariff negotiations among ourselves, anyone else who wants to join the GATT will then have to live up to our level of ambition. They have to negotiate their way in. And so this club approach, this plurilateral approach, allows us to make the negotiations easier. It allows us to kind of set the standard for the agreement, to shape the content of the agreement. And then ideally, it also allows us to compel the outsiders to join the agreement on our terms. Well, what are some of the concerns with this approach that have surfaced throughout the history of the GATT? Well, with this, the practicality, of course, comes at the cost of exclusiveness. And plurilateral negotiations in the GATT era were often very intransparent and have excluded most members of the trade regime. So if you look back, for example, to the Kennedy round, in order to be a member of the Trade Negotiations Committee, even, which was talking about the rules for the negotiations, you had to make a commitment that you would reciprocate concessions. So if you didn't make certain substantive commitments to begin with as a down payment, you were not even allowed in the room. It was often also not clear that negotiations were happening to a large part of the membership, because they would be initiated among the Quad or among even just the EU and the United States. And so the practicality, the greater practicality of negotiating in a smaller group often came at the cost of intransparency and exclusiveness. Well, it's also pretty easy to see what the concerns are about the insiders shaping the outcome of the negotiations, because of course, the outsiders are upset because they lose the ability to shape the rules, right? And so in the Tokyo round, that became very clear. Developing countries were extremely upset, for example, that they were not included in the same way as developed countries in the negotiations on customs valuation. They even drafted a rival code for adoption to show how upset they were. But there's a broader concern here. It's not just about shaping the rules within the negotiation. The other concern is that you lose control of the agenda. If smaller groups of countries can go ahead and negotiate among themselves, the outsiders lose the leverage that they gain by that smaller group needing the consent to a negotiating agenda, right? And so I think that becomes very clear in the Tokyo round, that there was great frustration on the part of developing countries that developing countries were able to negotiate outcomes which were addressing their concerns while disregarding some of the issues that were of concern to developing countries. And of course, it's hardly necessary to say why the last point is a ground for concern, because, well, obviously no country wants to be subject to rules which they have not written, right? And so this is a very live concern, I think, for developing countries throughout the history of the trade regime, is that developed countries and the insider would find some way to impose those rules which they negotiated among themselves on the outsiders later on. That could be by stealth, essentially, that those became de facto the rules. And that's, of course, what happened with the Tokyo Round codes. They became the blueprint for many of the agreements that form part of the single undertaking in the Uruguay Round itself. But even an agreement like the TRIPS agreement itself, which developing countries started negotiating on with the understanding that they would have essentially a veto on whether or could decide freely whether they would be able to, whether they would join it later on. And many developing countries stayed out of the negotiation entirely because they thought they would have the ability at the end not to join the agreement. And then suddenly we have the single undertaking, and you have to join all the agreements if you want to be part of the multilateral trade regime. So all these concerns, I think, have been very live throughout the history of the regime, and are quite understandable. So what's different today? Are these concerns equally valid today? Well, I think it's fair to say that there are fewer concerns about transparency and inclusiveness today. So it was interesting to see that in the paper that was in which South Africa and India voiced the opposition to the joint statement initiatives, they did not bring forward any concerns about transparency and exclusiveness. They didn't say that, well, we can't join or we don't know what's going on. And I mean, the mere fact that the joint statement initiatives start with joint statements, maybe try to observe, but that's a big difference to the Tokyo round, when some developing countries didn't find out until the very late stage of the negotiations that there were actually no negotiations going on, for example, on a new anti-dumping, a revision to the anti-dumping code, or on the agreement on civil aircraft, right? So they found out at the very end of the negotiations that developing countries were negotiating those issues. And secondly, we can also see, of course, a much broader participation in the joint statement initiatives than we saw in the Tokyo round codes, and including a much broader participation by developing countries. So arguably, those concerns about transparency and exclusiveness are much less live today than they were during the GATT years. It's also the case that outsiders have more leverage, arguably, to maximize benefits, and I do think that's due to the legal aspects that Myrto and James discussed. We have a consensus requirement in Article 10.9, which didn't exist during the GATT years. So in the GATT years, developing countries tried to get that leverage. They tried to make the adoption of the codes subject to a consensus decision by the Trade Negotiations Committee, and were unsuccessful in doing that. So now we essentially have the situations that the developing countries wish they had in the Tokyo round. And also, as Myrto and James mentioned, if we are looking at the implementation of these agreements through scheduling, there's always the possibility for a member to block the certification of schedules. And so outsiders, arguably, because the WTO has this integrated institutional framework, have more leverage than they had in the GATT over the proponents of the plurilateral approach. And so they could use that leverage to make sure that they are not disadvantaged by these agreements. Finally, I think one reason developing countries may want to look differently at the joint statement initiatives than they used to look at the plurilateral negotiations in the GATT is the alternatives are arguably worse. Like preferential trade agreements, what will happen if these joint statement initiatives don't succeed? Clearly, the proponents are probably going to implement them in the form of a preferential trade agreement. And those preferential trade agreements would afford developing countries much fewer procedural and substantive rights. What do I mean here? Procedural rights, of course, concern transparency. One thing that outsiders could demand is that they should be allowed to be observers on committee meetings if a joint statement initiative is implemented, but also substantive rights. And there, of course, I'm referring primarily to most favored nation rules. And finally, if developing countries or certain countries block the implementation of the joint statement initiatives in the WTO, it would further damage the WTO as a negotiating forum. And that is clearly not in developing countries' interests, given that the WTO is the best shot that they have for addressing many of their trade concerns. Let me just conclude by saying, well, there is a central concern that remains, and that is concern about control of the agenda, right? So in both the e-commerce context and domestic regulation services context, we see that there are multilateral mandates which are being essentially, which weren't effectively pursued, but which are being shoved to the sidelines slightly by the joint statement initiatives. And I think there's a real valid concern here from developing countries that the multilateral mandates that are being negotiated with the interests of all countries in mind are losing their value, are losing their significance. And so I think the proponents of the joint statement initiatives have to think very, very carefully about how they're going to address that. And so one idea might be to think about the joint statement initiatives as a portfolio, and to make sure that in that portfolio of different joint statement initiatives, there is something that also addresses the interests that developing countries are pursuing in the trade regime. So to make sure that the joint statement initiatives reflect the balance of interest that is represented in the WTO.
Thank
you.
So
that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. I feel like asking each of you whether there's something you would like to add before we go to the floor. But this would be just 1 or 2 minutes each. And allow me to just point on 2 issues. Many questions concern the formal plurilateral of Annex 4, for which a consensus is needed. I don't think this is what you're talking about. You're more talking about something else. Where to fit it is a bit the question. And allow me to also recall, as Nicholas did, that right after the Tokyo round, after the documents were sent for ratification, governments adopted the famous enabling clause, which is clearly a violation of Article 1. An amendment would have been needed. It was not done for 30 years. It's okay now because the enabling clause was integrated into the WTO. So my last comment before I ask you, Myrto, is even the WTO treaties that states how you should vote for ABCD provision was set aside the first year when I started for a consensus type approach. And this was done by a little decision here by ambassadors. Again, a violation of the basic rules. Nonetheless, the enabling clause and the consensus are, in my view, fundamental feature of WTO. Isn't it good sometimes to shake up the box? So I don't know whether, Myrto, you want to add something before we go to the questions, and then James, and then Nicholas, but really 2 minutes because there are lots of interesting questions. Myrto, you're muted.
Sorry, not even 2 minutes, just 20 seconds. There was something I wanted to add to the conclusion of Nicholas's presentation about the downsides of the alternatives is also the spaghetti ball. Because, for example, I'll give you the e-commerce digital trade example, where we have most new RTAs and FTAs, including provisions on e-commerce digital trade, but they're not identical. So in the end, you do have the regulatory effects. You do have the loss of influence, the loss of leverage, the loss of transparency. And in addition, you have conflicting rules fighting for influence among the non-participants. So that for me is another reason to welcome new plurilateral negotiations into the WTO to have also consistency. Thanks. That's all I want. And then I'm also open, of course, to questions. Thanks.
James, 1 or 2 minutes. Do you want to add something?
Nothing actually. In fact, there was something that was not mentioned in my presentation. So what I wanted to mention was the problem with the plurilaterals, especially in terms of losing the balance. So when we think about even the domestic regulation in services, it is only one of the many issues actually. And there are a number of issues within the services agreement which requires, a way forward, which requires some kind of work. This is true with many other areas as well. So once we go for a plurilateral approach, then it will be very difficult to achieve the balance in the negotiation. And especially given the fact that a number of issues are actually unfinished in the context of the Doha round, I think this balance will be even more lost once we have the plurilaterals. I just want to mention this point. That's it. Thank you.
Nicholas, thank you, James.
I just actually wanted to ask a question of Murto. And the question is, you mentioned that the types of agreements that you should be possible in WTO would not impose any obligations on other members, would not take away from their rights and would be open to them. But what about extending the benefits of the agreements on an MFN basis? So are you, when you're thinking about the joint statement initiatives as the EU, would you like to implement them on a conditional MFN basis so that non-participants would not get the benefits of the agreement?
Do you want to answer this, or should we ask a few questions? Okay, because this came also.
Yeah, I could answer that quickly. I think there is a difference to be made between plurilateral outcomes that are on the scope of the WTO agreements and those that are not. So the GPA equivalent, if you will. I don't think there is any grounds at all to say that you can have non-MFN outcomes on issues that are under the agreement. I think that will have to be a decision of the participants, whether there is critical mass to address any free riding effects, but they would have to be on an MFN basis. The question is when you are dealing with subject matter that are not under the agreement, whether you would do a conditional MFN a la GPA. But that again, for me, that would fall under my third discussion point, which is how do we facilitate the incorporation of plurilaterals into the WTO? That it's not something that I think can be done except by consensus Annex 4 under the current agreement.
Thank you. So we've received a few questions. I suggest I'll try to group them and read a few, and then, as I said, you answer those you like. So the first one concerns the fact that plurilaterals reduce substantially the negotiating power of small, poorer developing countries. So to integrate plurilateral in the legal framework, you would need, according to this person, an Annex 5 type provision. And this, for that person, would require consensus. So how can it be made acceptable for developing country to include those plurilateral? I think Nicholas is in part giving an answer, but I would translate that into saying, do you need consensus to have different speed agreements if they remain open? It was just mentioned that you can have plurilateral that are, the benefits are given MFN and possibly others differently. Another question comes from Elisa Baroncini. Should the positive consensus under Article 10.9 not be possible to reach and no other WTO agreed solution feasible, will the EU go ahead and conclude plurilateral formally outside the WTO? And how to deal with dispute settlement? Another question, how to conciliate the launch of negotiations on GSI framework with paragraph 34 of the Nairobi Ministerial Declaration. Isn't it the provision on the balance? A critical mass or open plurilateral Are they viable alternatives? And finally, what is the biggest threat faced by the WTO with those plurilateral? Allow me to ask a last question. We'll come back. How to deal with the DSU disputes, assuming it works fully, in GSI? So a lot of more policy and technical questions. How do we start? Should we start in the reverse with Nicholas, maybe? And you pick the questions you like. You don't need to answer questions. You can make statements.
Well, I'm trying to imagine the end game. Like if it really comes to the situation where it's clear that some WTO members, such as India and South Africa, are not going to allow agreements to be added to Annex 4, what is gonna happen? What are the outs here? And I think there's a very the nuclear option looks different for agreements that you may want to implement on a conditional MFN basis. And I don't know, I'm reading into your remarks, Myrtle, that maybe the e-commerce negotiations are in that category, but I don't know whether that's right. Whereas domestic regulation and others, which could be implemented on an MFN basis. So there's always the option, of course, under the Marrakesh Agreement, to amend the WTO agreement without a consensus, right? So if you amend the WTO agreement without a consensus, you just need to vote, and then 2/3 of the membership have to sign up for the amendment to enter into force. And so I'm wondering whether that's an option that should be more openly discussed. That we, as long as you have a critical mass, those countries which would have to approach, of course, 2/3 of the membership, those countries could go forward, amend the WTO agreement, even if there's no consensus. And I think that would actually be healthy development. But of course, the one key limitation is there that you wouldn't be able to implement those agreements on a conditional MFN basis, right? So the agreements that you implement, and my understanding is that the agreement that you implement through an amendment would still be subject to the MFN clause. Which then leaves the question, well, what do you do with agreements that you want to do on a conditional MFN basis? And I simply don't see a way of getting around the consensus rule that we currently have. And I do think that they would probably then, as unfortunate as it is, have to take the form of an agreement outside the World Trade Organization.
I don't know, James, if you want to add something, and I would send my own question. Without a functioning dispute settlement system at the moment, almost 20 of the panels have been appeal in the void. Does it change something to the dynamic of plurilaterals?
Yeah, Gabriel, my feeling is that I think the plurilateral approaches is coming only because of honest, sincere engagement. And I think the plurilateral initiatives are also actually in a way going only for a partial engagement. So if the WTO system, especially the dispute settlement system, has to get back to its functioning mode, then we need greater engagement. And obviously, I think more engagement will completely denounce this kind of plurilateral approaches. So when we think about even, there has been a suggestion about adding one more annex called Annex 5. When there's a clear provision, which is definitely Annex 4 in Article 2, if the issues are amenable to all the countries, then I think that is the way the agreement should be added to Annex 4. And I think time is still not lost on that point. The plurilaterals are still accepted within the system. The only issue, the issue which I mentioned was with respect to how to translate the outcome in the plurilateral negotiation into some kind of a binding commitment. And mainly with respect to inscribing them in the schedule, even in an agreement like the domestic regulation looks problematic. And sometimes in order to actually avoid the consensus thing, countries can still implement their concessions without getting them certified. That option is still there. And as Nicholas also rightly pointed out, if there is actually a critical, so about critical mass, I have one more question. The way the joint statements are coming up, it doesn't even appear that a critical mass is required. So for instance, the joint initiative on domestic regulation in services has less than 80 members. So, that is again an issue. I think assuming that two-thirds majority voting is required for making an amendment, and assume that all the agreements have got that critical mass of meeting the voting requirement, then of course that is an option provided under the agreement, which the members can definitely invoke. But given the lack of clarity, I think on most of these issues, my feeling is that this is something which the proponents should have thought earlier. I mean, this thought process should have actually happened earlier, before the negotiations were entered into. So there is actually a problem, in the offing. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Mirto, do you want to answer any of those questions? In particular, the risk for developing country, it's quite important.
I agree.
To keep them on board.
I agree. And well, one thing is that you do have quite a few developing countries participating in the GSIs. So I would object to the lumping together of developing countries as a uniform group of members that all feel the same way. That is, that's not quite the true picture. And also, if you look at, for example, at the investment facilitation GSI, that has specific development overtones. I mean, it's called investment facilitation for developing countries, and it is largely a developing country initiative. So I think for me, there is a much greater risk vis-a-vis developing countries in the WTO ceasing to be effective. I'm not going to use the word collapsing because international organizations don't really collapse, but if it ceases to be effective and binding rulemaking forum, then that would be that would lead to the most harm for developing countries. That's one. I also wanted to, I still haven't heard, in terms of the scheduling approach and Article 18 of the GATS, I'm still wondering why this is a problem and why there needs to be consensus for an additional commitment to be inscribed pursuant to Article 18 of the GATS in the schedules of members. I mean, that I genuinely do not understand. And then would the Article 5, Article 24 concern that we can't just go ahead and conclude agreements outside the WTO if we want to be WTO compatible unless they adhere to GATS Article 5 and GATT Article 24 disciplines. On the other hand, I mean, we're not averse to that. We've done it with TISA, right? But we still consider that the best forum for new rules to develop is the WTO and should be the WTO, and that we should not deprive ourselves from the possibility of starting something in the WTO that can then be multilateralized. If there is political will. I mean, for me, it's a question of political will. If we want to do this, we will do this. It's as simple as that. Yeah.
Thank you. James, can you mute yourself, please? I think there's an echo.
Sure, I will do that.
I will read out, we have a few minutes, a few other questions, one of which also concerns accessions. As you know, when a country exceeds, they may commit to obligations different from the others. Is this a threat to multilateralism? And it was mentioned the regional trade agreements where some countries within the WTO do things a bit differently. Is it a threat? A nice, interesting suggestions from Nicholas and Bowden is about linking a deal on agriculture, which is so important for developing country, to plurilaterals. Is it possible? Another question concerns, yes, some sort of mix of plurilateral, the new type, the GSI, plurilateral, that are limited to a subgroup to start with and then growing, and multilateral. Is it possible to conceive a different sort of mix? And finally, what about amendments of those GSI in the future, and inclusions of new members. Is it conceivable that we make a distinction between forming an agreement and its conclusion, its formal conclusion, that would be delayed once the 2/3 or here consensus is reached? So I will start with James. You pick the questions you like. James, you're muted.
Can you just get back to this question a bit later? Maybe.
Okay. Nicholas, do you feel comfortable sharing some answers? There's so many good ideas in those questions.
So the first that I would like to pick up is the one on accessions. And of course, that is one of the concerns, is that the accessions negotiations of new WTO members could be used to impose this joint statement initiatives on those acceding members. And so here I would like to mention a proposal by Bernard Hockman and Chuck Sable, which would essentially is of a code of conduct for JSIs, which would make it clear that essentially it would be a commitment by the proponents of JSIs that they will not do that they will not require anyone to accede to the GSIs in accessions. And I think that could address some of the concerns that we might see the pattern that we saw in the yoga round repeat itself, where something which is styled as a plurilateral agreement then later becomes de facto binding on a certain group of members.
But Nicholas, isn't it already done by WTO member independently of the JSI, where
yes, of course it's done, but it
impose higher obligations?
Yes, it is currently being done, but it would alleviate potentially some of the concerns of the opponents of JSIs if we got a commitment from the proponents that they will not do that. Because as I mentioned, one of the concerns with the plurilateral approach in the past has always been that by one way or another, those obligations which are negotiated among a small group will in some form be imposed on the outsiders, right? And so that would be one thing that proponents could do to reassure those who fear kind of the return of the GATT days, that they will simply not do that, right? There could be a commitment in that vein. The second point I wanted to pick up on is the one linking it to agriculture. And I do sometimes hope that countries like India and South Africa would kind of go back to the good old grand bargain idea to say, look, we're going to give you your Annex 4 agreement. We're going to not block the consensus on an Annex 4 agreement, but here are our demands. This is what we want in return. And I think that might be would be more productive approach than simply saying, well, you can't do Annex 4 without our consent. If you don't put anything on the table that you want in return, how are we going to move forward? And so I think it would be great if South Africa and India recognize that this is a moment where they have genuine leverage. They have leverage which comes from the structure of the WTO and the consensus requirement in Annex 10.9. But why, instead of simply saying we're going to block you, why not say, look, here are some concrete demands that we can negotiate about, which we want to see satisfied if you want your conditional MFN agreement under Annex 4.
Thank you. I'll go to Myrto to leave a bit of time to James. Myrto, any answer to any of those questions? But I have a special question for you. Are there any limits to what can be scheduled? Keeping in mind that the old Article 2 of GATT on tariff refers to anything affecting commerce. So are there things that should not be put in schedules?
I think there comes a point where it becomes very awkward to schedule certain things. I mean, as I said, I'm more of a GATT expert, and in services, I think there's even a bigger leeway of what can be scheduled. But I can imagine rules that directly interact with other rules, and that is not a straightforward self-standing proposition, but cross-references 15 other provisions, then that might be a bit more complicated. I think you can squeeze just about anything in a schedule. The question is, do we want to, and at what point does it become too artificial? And at what point should we not seek more authentic ways to do things? I mean, call an agreement, as opposed to an additional commitment.
Do you want to answer other questions, or I go to James?
I leave the remaining time to James.
Thank you, Gabriel. With respect to that linking issue between plurilaterals and agriculture, my impression was that India's and South African proposal was based on a principle. And if you look at the agriculture agreement, there are a host of issues. The whole agreement itself is actually fairly outdated. The calculation methodologies are completely weird in a way. And obviously, there are many issues for India in the context of services, especially with respect to the Mode 4, an area where no substantial changes actually happened in the last 25 years. So there are a number of issues where I think if you really want to link, but you can perhaps link. But my own feeling is that Indian and South African proposals are based upon a clear legal, I think, footing. It's very clear. I mean, if you look at the Marrakesh Agreement and what India and South Africa are arguing, nobody can actually find too many faults with that. But obviously, I mean, there are practical and strategic issues. The fact that nothing is moving on the negotiation, we can agree with all these things. So that is why I, even initially mentioned that engagement is only way out, not partial engagement. So with this view, I feel that, I mean, I don't know what will happen at the end of the day when the MC12 happens, but my own feeling is that there is actually, the onus is basically on the joint proponents to come up with a much more inclusive and a respectful agenda, a respectful approach for the basic principles of WTO. That is my own feeling.
We may have a few minutes, and maybe I have an interesting question that comes from Ambassador Mina's sort of statement, where he says that the GSI, at least some of them, are an occasion or an effort to bring into the WTO ideas and things developed in regional contexts or bilateral contexts, if I think of e-commerce. And this is very healthy. When I arrive at the WTO, I remember the excitement, the absolute body selection and all this. When you go to an e-commerce GSI meeting virtually as a staff, I get the same feeling. The people in the room really believe in the system. They want to make concessions. They want to make the system evolve. So if GSI are not a route, what is the route to capture these 50, 80, 100 members who still believe in trade as the solution to the problems? What's the solution? For me, GSI is the reform. I'm not saying they're not differences, but it's an effort. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's an honest effort. What's the answer if it's not that? James, or Nicholas, or Mito.
Sometimes it is quite difficult to talk about all this issue, but let me also talk about some possibilities. Now, if somebody wants to bring a very divisive issue, let's say market orientation in WTO, or maybe industrial subsidies, or maybe even labor matters, then I think the problem here is that we are potentially opening the floodgates. So now, on the one side, we can argue that, okay, here this is actually a positive and a constructive effort in order to have some kind of, I think ambitious agreement, at least among certain people who can do it, maybe taken from a regional setting, or maybe from a particular good model. But there are also flip sides to it. I mean, which are the points which I just mentioned, market orientation, WTO, a very important issue. Even some of the existing joint statement proponents, I'm sure, will not be very happy with it. So, when we think about this issue, we have to think it holistically. And that is precisely the challenge. So I would actually stop here, given the sense.
James, you stimulated, there's a lot of questions, but I see Ambassador Mina has a question. And then if Mary allows me, I will take after the question of Myrto and Nicholas. But Ambassador Mina, please.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Look, I just really wanted to respond to your question rather than pose another one. Lots of questions already here. And that is to say, this energy that you're talking about is real, and it's very, very significant. The 110 members in various ways, developing, involved in the various plurilateral negotiations underway in the JSIs. Now, Nicholas's insights earlier, I think, were very apposite. That demonstrated this was and is the predominant mode of rulemaking in the GATT-WTO system. So it's nothing novel here. This is a long-standing practice. And the idea that we could jump to universality at the outset of a negotiation, I think is a little bit impractical. The legal paths are there. There's several paths. Now, obviously, Article 18, GATT's Article 7, there are lots of different, the scheduling approach, there are lots of, course, Annex 4. There are lots of different legal paths there. But, I mean, there is a strategic question facing those who are opposing these initiatives. They're not just not participating, but they're actually actively opposing. And that question is, do you really want to undermine the WTO and the healthy energy that's there in the WTO system and force these outside of the WTO system? Is that in your interests? So I think that's a question that some of the critics need to face up to. But it is really quite important to take the longer view. And the longer view is that this is the prominent mode of rulemaking. Thanks, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Ambassador Mina. Mary, can I allow Mirto and Nicholas to speak, or we have to stop?
Unfortunately, and I hate to do this, I have to cut off the panel. It's always good to end on a note wanting more, but we have already the next panels lined up, and we need to onboard them. So maybe, Gabrielle, I leave you 20 seconds if you want to answer any last things yourself. Otherwise,
I think Ambassador Mina gave the perfect answer. I'm not sure we know how, but it is certainly an effort, plurilateral, the new type, the GSI, an effort of those who believe in trade to try to push the big boat, and it's a big boat ahead. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for all the speakers. I mean, your interventions were great. Thank you to all the participants. Sorry, I couldn't deal with all the questions. And thank you to Mary and all the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to the panel. We will now head into a brief 15-minute break, as it's indicated on the program. I invite you to use the break to try out a fun and interactive networking platform, GatherTown. My colleague will post the link in the chat. You will be able to reconnect to this conference for the next session using the same Zoom link that you used to sign on earlier today. I look forward to welcoming you back in 15 minutes for our hackathon plenary, where our 3 finalists will present their innovative proposals in front of our esteemed jury. So thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you.